Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're having a look at an amplifier that you may not have heard about because it hasn't had a great deal of publicity. Specifically, it's the SMSL HO200. To put this quickly into perspective for you, this is a $399 headphone amplifier and preamp, which makes it around about a $550 Australian dollar device. At that price, it sits above the SMSL SH8S that I reviewed recently here on the channel with its companion DAC, the SU8S, and it adds extra functionality in the form of preamps, an extra gain level, and a few extra bells and whistles that you may find interesting. Before I explain more about the amp, I'd just like to say a thank you to Aoshita Audio for sending me the HO200 for review. There's no affiliates or kickbacks with this review, but I do want to say thank you, and as always, I'll put a link down below where you can click through and buy from Aoshita Audio as a way of saying thank you to them for sending out the unit. For now though, let's take a look at the HO200 before I tell you a bit more about it.
Don't you say it, I can't hear it, I get defensive when I think you're calling me out. But I don't scream, I don't shout. I seethe in my anger, I swallow my answers, I try to listen, but it's all bubbling out. Can you hear me now?
Much like the SH8S that I've got sitting here in front of me now to show you the two of them side by side, the HO200 will output 3 watts into 32 ohms. That's obviously maximum power levels, but that should give you a sense that there is plenty of power for any headphone that you'd want to use with the HO200. I'll put that into perspective in a little while as to exactly what that means, but suffice to say, it's got all the power that you're going to need at a very reasonable price. Of course, the question then is how does it sound, but we will cover that shortly. First, let me put aside the SH8S and talk about the HO200. So the HO200 is an op-amp based design using feedback to generate very, very low distortion levels. As I've talked about in some of my previous reviews, using op-amps with multiple layers of feedback can produce really clean, crisp sound from a measurement point of view, but it doesn't always equate to the most enjoyable sound. That therefore was one of my biggest questions coming into this review, was whether or not the HO200 suffered that same lack of engagement and interest and naturalness that some of these designs can. There's plenty of examples of good and plenty of examples of bad, so it's not like there's a one single answer that if it's an op-amp design it's bad or good. There's variations between all of them. For me, what's also more important than just the measurements on paper is the functionality of the amp itself, what it's like to interact with. The HO200 has a fantastic design that is very, very enjoyable to interact with. To give you a quick tour, we've got multiple outputs along the front here, including 4-pin XLR balanced. We've got an unbalanced 6.3mm and then a balanced 4.4mm. And it's great to see more and more amps coming with the 4.4mm connection, particularly those amps that are suitable for IEMs as this is intended to be. Moving along the front panel, we've got a volume knob here, which is generally quite nice to interact with, but it's a little bit shallow, so I would much prefer, I don't know how well you can see that if I put it against the white perhaps, it's quite a shallow volume knob, there's not much to grip onto, so it's not particularly enjoyable to grasp and interact with. I would have preferred to see something just a little bit deeper. On top of that, SMSL used this sort of beveled edge design where it's an angled bevel to give the silver shine of the aluminium that's underneath the black. And whilst it looks pretty, it does feel a bit rough and harsh to the fingertips. So I'm not overly a fan of the volume controls on these. I don't particularly enjoy interacting with them in that regard. But at the same time, it's certainly not a deal breaker and not a reason to buy or not buy the HO200 or indeed any of SMSL's amps. Moving along the rest of the front though, that's where we get some great functionality. We've got an XLR or RCA switch for the inputs on the back, we'll get to those in a moment. We've got the pre or headphone amplifier switch, so this is a switchable output for your headphone outputs or your preamp outputs, which again we'll talk about in a moment. That's becoming a more and more common feature these days because balanced outputs can't mute the preamp outputs using the connection of the headphones. So it's becoming much more common, and it does make these very versatile devices. The next switch we've got is probably the big differentiator for the HO200 compared to something like the SH8S, as a headphone amplifier at least. And that is that it has a multi-level gain switch with low, medium and high. And I emphasize low because this is designed to drive IEMs comfortably. And whilst I do think it's still just a little bit too high in gain for IEMs, it comes much closer by including low gain mode. And I'll talk about that soon and what exactly that means. The final switch on the front is the power switch, but there is also a power switch on the back. So this switch on the front is more of a standby switch. Even though it's a toggle, it's more of a standby than a full main switch. I don't know what that means for power consumption and power draw when the front is off but the back is on. I haven't tested that, I don't intend to, but I did want to mention that there are two power switches if that's of any interest to you. So now while we're looking at the back, let's do a quick tour of the back, which is pretty straightforward and simple and like any other headphone preamp combo. We've got power, as I've already mentioned, we've got XLR and RCA outputs, we've got RCA inputs and XLR inputs, and hiding in the middle there, you'll see a micro USB socket, which is for servicing capabilities. So I'm assuming there's diagnostics, maybe there's firmware capabilities within the HO200, I'm not entirely sure, but that's what the micro USB is there for. There's no DAC or anything included. So having toured the amp now, it should be pretty clear that this is a pretty straightforward, normal headphone and preamp. There's nothing fancy, there's nothing different to usual, so the big question is, how well does it perform in terms of power output and the quality of the sound? I'm going to address power output first. I've tried this with both IEMs and difficult to drive headphones. The HO200 had no problems at all, driving everything including the Susvaras and the DT880s. Now I'm not suggesting that this is an amplifier I would recommend for the Susvaras, they do deserve a much higher quality power than this can provide, but the key point is if it can drive the Susvara, it can drive anything else on the planet basically, in terms of headphones at least. So the HO200 was driving the Susvaras in high gain at about the 9 to 10 o'clock position, so hardly anything on the gain knob about where it sits now. To put that into perspective, it goes all the way up to the 7 o'clock position. So we were probably at around about 25% power, and it was comfortably driving the Susvaras to good listenable levels. In other words, you're going to have no trouble driving any headphone that you want to drive with the HO200. In case you've got higher impedance headphones, it also managed the DT880 250 ohms with no issues at all in medium gain, sitting at about the 12 o'clock position, so somewhere around there. That means if you've got 300 ohm Sennheisers, ZMFs, any of those higher impedance cans, this will be fine. If you've got difficult low impedance planers, this will be fine. And then of course, with that low gain mode, in theory, it's also going to do fine for IEMs. So I plugged in my BGVP DM8s and gave it a try. The reason I use the BGVPs is because they've got a 13 ohm impedance, meaning that they're very, very easy to drive. What I found with the BGVPs, or I might say DM8s because it's easier, what I found with the DM8s was that even on low gain, at 0 volume, there was some sound leakage coming through, regardless of whether I used single-ended or balanced output. So you can't actually get it dead silent, but the good news is it's music coming through, not hiss. Or at least if there is hiss, it's so low that I couldn't hear it beneath the little tiny bit of sound leakage coming through. The DM8s did show me that there's a bit of channel imbalance up to about the 8 o'clock position, and usable volume range starts to kick in at around about 9 o'clock. So even with low gain, there's not a huge amount of play on the volume pot if you're using a balanced input, which is often 4 volts, and the balanced outputs here. It was slightly better using single-ended output, still using balanced input, but even then it was just a little bit hot for my tastes. The gain levels on low gain are minus 4 dB for balanced and minus 10 dB for single-ended, but I actually think they could have afforded to double that reduction. and make it say -8 and -20, -18, somewhere around there would have been nice just to give a bit more volume range, given that there is some channel imbalance down low on the volume range. Having said that, once you hit around about that 9 o'clock mark, channel balance is just fine and the sound is also just fine. There's no issues, there's no hiss, the sound is clean and crisp, exactly as it is with headphones is how it is with IEMs. And I'll talk about sound quality in just a moment. To sum up though, the HO200 does prove itself to be a very versatile amp in terms of power, being able to run everything from IEMs all the way through to your absolute most power-hungry headphones. A little bit less gain down low would have been good, but it's still quite usable. And so now let's talk about the sound. The sound from the HO200 is clean, it's smooth, it's detailed. It's not particularly exciting or engaging, but there's nothing at all to complain about. For those of you who enjoy the topping and the SMSL type designs where it's really focused on purity and clarity of signal, you're probably going to really like the HO200 as well. I'm going to compare it with the SH8S shortly to put it into perspective of how it performs against that, and in my upcoming review of the topping L50, I dare say the HO200 will come forward again. I haven't compared it to the L50 for today, but do watch out for the L50 review, which is coming next straight after this one. To continue with the sound in isolation though, I'd say that the overall sound is, as I said before, clean and neutral. It doesn't have any sense of emphasis throughout the signature. It is fairly smooth and clean, so it doesn't have any sense of digital dryness or artificiality necessarily, but I would have liked to hear just a little bit more articulation and kind of crispness at the leading edge of notes. And what I mean by that is that there's a sense that some of the things like guitar strums, snare hits, things where there are those crisp leading edges to the sounds, those don't have quite the level of attack that I'd like to hear. It's not that it's bad, and I am kind of getting to the point where I'm splitting hairs a little bit just to separate this from other things you might have heard, but it is an area where I do think it just lacks a tiny bit of engagement and may sound just a tiny bit flat, both in terms of dynamics but also in terms of presentation, soundstage, depth, imaging, etc. It does sound just a tiny bit flat and unengaging because of its kind of overly polite delivery of the sound. I can't stress enough, it's not bad, it's a really nice amp that I do think sits comfortably in the same world as things like the topping A90, the SMSL SH8S, and I assume the SH9, as well as other op-amp based amps such as things like the Gishelli Airish, the Shit Heresy, the IE Magni that I reviewed recently. It's in the same ballpark where it's doing things well, but it's not an emotionally engaging amplifier, as many of those also aren't. Before I provide a couple of specific examples to really clarify what I mean by all that, I just want to mention variations or lack of between the different inputs and outputs. Firstly, with the front outputs, we've got balanced and single-ended outputs, and both perform very similarly. There might be a tiny bit of extra brightness and clarity, I guess you'd call it, from the balanced outputs compared to the single-ended, but I'd say that could also come down to the quality of the contacts and the plugs themselves. Simple things like the impedance of the plugs, the way the connection is made, those things can have very subtle influence on the sound, and it's small enough that that's all it could be. So it's not something where I'd say don't bother with the single-ended, only use the balance or anything like that. I think you can very comfortably use both balanced and single-ended and never notice the difference unless you're deliberately comparing the two. Turning to the back of the amp, when I compared the inputs balanced and single-ended using the same interconnects, so they were AudioQuest Yukon XLRs and AudioQuest Yukon RCAs, I heard no difference at all, and that's great news. So whether you've got a balanced DAC or a single-ended DAC feeding into the HO200, you're going to get identical performance. And that's fantastic. That's, to me, exactly what you want from an amplifier. You don't want the amp to dictate what you need to have up the chain. For example, if you have a great single-ended DAC, like a Chord Cutest, not that I'm suggesting that's necessarily a pairing you want here, but the Chord Cutest is well known for being an outstanding DAC that some people see as being limited by only having single-ended outputs. If you were to pair that up with something like the HO200, you're getting no negative consequences as a result. Similarly, something like the topping E30 would be another example. You can plug that into the HO200, enjoy balanced outputs to your headphones should you want it, and have zero consequences for using a balanced DAC. So I do really appreciate that about the HO200. And so at this point we've got an amp that performs solidly in isolation. It's not the most engaging and articulate amplifier, but it's certainly completely fine, and I have no complaints about its sound. It's got great functionality, having both preamp and headphone outputs, and inputs and outputs that are essentially indistinguishable, meaning that you can use any combination of balanced and single-ended inputs and outputs without worrying that you might not be getting the best possible sound. So we're on a good thing so far. To see just how good it is though, let's put it up against a couple of competitors. The first obvious competitor for me was the SH8S that I spoke about before. The main reason for that being that these are very, very similar amps. The biggest differences that I can see is that the SH8S does not have the low gain mode for IEMs and is also not preamp capable. So it's very simple: input RCA or XLR and output to headphones. The SH8S retails for $230, making it $169 less than the HO200. So the big question at first becomes whether or not you want to spend the extra for preamp functionality and IEM functionality. If you do, the next question comes down to sound quality. Comparing these two side by side, listening to Scream, Funk My Life Up by Paolo Nutini, what I heard was two amps that are very, very similar, but also with their differences. I was surprised to hear that the SH8S actually comes across as being just a little bit more detailed and textured compared to the HO200. The HO200, on the other hand, does come across as being just a little bit smoother overall. The difference is very small, so we're talking 1 or 2% differences, but there's no doubt that there's differences there. Another difference that I noticed was that the SH8S stretches the soundstage just a little bit wider and probably separates the sounds maybe just a tiny bit more. The HO200, on the other hand, does keep things potentially more coherent. So some of you will actually prefer the HO200 sound because it's a little bit smoother and a little bit more of a sort of single massive sound. And I don't mean that it's muddy and congested. What I mean is it doesn't pull things apart quite as much. The SH8S though will appeal to those that want a bit more width in the soundstage and do want a little bit more detail and texture that therefore also helps to separate sounds a little bit more. I think for me, if you don't necessarily need the preamp outputs and IEM functionality, I do think the SH8S is probably the amp I would go for, but if you do have headphones that are a bit more aggressive, say HD800s, some of the Beyerdynamics, you would probably appreciate the more smooth presentation of the HO200. So in short, both I think are excellent amps with just slightly varying presentations and tonality overall, but we are talking slight. It's a 3 to 5% maximum variation between the two. So putting aside the SH8S now, we're going to talk about my other comparison, which is the Singxer SA1. The SA1 retails for $599, which makes it $200 more than the HO200. Other than that, they've got fairly similar functionality in terms of being balanced inputs and balanced outputs for both headphones and preamp functionality. The SA1 doesn't have low gain mode, but it does have a large enough volume range to comfortably work for most IEMs. For this comparison, I was listening to The One by Blues Traveler, and what I heard in this fairly busy track with lots going on was that the SA1 was both smoother, but also more detailed, textured, and nuanced. The SA1 brought forward a better sense of resolution and detail and texture in the sound. So whether it was the drums, the vocals, the guitar work, everything just had a bit more realism and was a bit more lifelike in the overall presentation. In contrast, the HO200 did make things sound just a little bit artificial. And that's not so much a knock on the HO200 as a representation of why I always tend to lean towards personally and recommend discrete design amps. The SA1 uses individual components such as transistors, resistors and capacitors to produce the end output sound, whereas the HO200 and other amps like it use op amps which basically pile all of those bits and pieces into single chips. The result tends to be a less dynamic, less nuanced sound compared to a discrete design. Of course, the flip side of that is that the discrete designs cost more money because there's more design involved and there's also more parts. So again, I'm not saying the HO200 is bad just because the SA1 does better. The SA1 is $200 more. You would certainly hope that it sounded better for that value, and it's good to see that it does, but it doesn't shame the HO200. Ultimately, what it does is it shows me where exactly the HO200 sits, and that is that it's an excellent op-amp based, very clean sounding amplifier that may not be the last word in engagement and emotion and articulation, but is very, very solid as a do-it-all device for IEMs, normal headphones, difficult headphones, preamp capabilities, single-ended, all balanced inputs and outputs. It's very versatile and very effective in that regard. I don't have a topping A90 here anymore to compare this to the A90, but I do see this as very much a kind of baby brother to the A90. Yes, they're different brands, but technically SMSL and Topping are all owned by the same parent company, I believe. And so this is kind of like a less powerful, but still plenty powerful version of the A90 that may not sound quite as good as the A90 in terms of things like detail retrieval and overall transparency, but it's well on the way there and a very enjoyable amp. So if you're in the market for a headphone amplifier and you don't need preamp functionality, the SH8S from SMSL would probably still be my recommendation. But if you want to drive IEMs and or you want preamp function, the HO200 is a very, very solid choice. Of course, if you can spend more, I do think the SA1 is better again, but it's a big jump up in price. So to wrap things up, I want to say a huge thanks once again to Ayashida Audio for sending me the HO200, particularly given that it's not one of the most well-known and most talked about amps on the market, but it is one that I think's worth considering. So to say thank you to them, don't forget there's a link down below. If you are thinking about buying any of those amps that I've mentioned in this review, do check out Ayashida Audio and see what they have to offer. As I said before, there's no kickbacks or affiliates, it's just saying thank you. While we're speaking of saying thank you, if you've found this review useful and you enjoy the content on this channel, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe and like. It really helps the channel more than you can imagine. For now though, let me leave you to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.